And this is what we'll go through today. And we've got a pretty crisp presentation at this point. So we're going to talk you through the timeline and what you can expect as you go through the review process, introduce you to the submittable platform, which I hope you all have signed up for. And if you haven't, you should, because then you can play around with it. Criteria for evaluating grants, and just general guidelines for committee participation. And there you see the sort of the structure of the committees laid out. It's a great team, and you'll find that out soon enough. And now I'll turn this over to Latina.
Thanks, Dan. So this slide, we really just wanted to give you a big picture look at what the timeline for the grant review process looks like. So the applications are pouring in. We had 89 draft applications the last time I checked. So that process will close on March 8th, and that essentially kicks off our round one review, which, as you can see, leads all the way up to our big award event in September. So we'll kind of walk through each of the rounds in a little bit more detail. So Janelle, if you want to go on to the next slide. Round one is really where we're doing the bulk of the review work. So that's where we're going to be reviewing and evaluating the applications. So this process kicks off around March 11th, 9th through the 11th is when we'll get all the applications. They'll be assigned to the focus area committees. And then the focus area committee chairs will go through the process of assigning applications to the focus area committee members. So shortly after that March 11th date, you should start to see your assignments come in. That review process concludes around April 12th with the identification of the top applications to move on to round two. So that brings us to the review platform that Anne mentioned, which is called Submittable. Janelle, if you want to go on to the next slide. This is where we're going to be doing all of the work. This is where we're going to manage the grant application process as well as the review process. So at this point, you should have all received an email directly from notifications@submittable.com. That email will give you access to the grant platform. Registration is pretty straightforward. You just click the link. It will then take you to creating a password. Whichever email that you use to sign up for your focus area committee is the email that was used to generate the initial response. So that's generally the username. And so once you create the password, it'll take you to the Impact100DC landing page. And so just kind of want to reiterate, that is a legit email. If you see it, go ahead and click the link. That will, pretty intuitively lead you through the steps that I just discussed. So once you accept and create your account, you'll see that there's one test application in the system that will be assigned to everyone. That is not, that's just a test application to get you a little bit more familiar with the platform. So next slide, Janelle. As for all of the applications, as I mentioned, you'll get an email that should start, you should start getting that sometime after March 11th. Again, that will come directly from Submittable. Will look somewhat similar to what you see on the screen, not those specific grants, but you'll see that type of email. Right now, we have the platform set up such that you'll only see the grants that you're ultimately assigned to review and score. We'll talk a little bit more about the roles and responsibilities, lead reviewers and additional reviewers. And so we're working through, we've gotten a lot of questions as to, well, why do I only get to see the applications that I'm assigned? Why can't I see all of the applications for the chapter, regardless of what focus area committee I'm in? And we really want those focus area applications to be confined within that focus area. And so we'll talk a little bit more information will come through your focus area chair in terms of, how those applications are being assigned amongst the members. A lot of it will come down to how many applications are received in that committee, as well as how many members are in that committee. So more information to come on that. We really just want to cover, kind of the process in terms of what Submittable looks like. So with that, I'd like to show a brief video that walks through Submittable So while Janelle is kind of queuing that up, I would like to point out that in some of the prior sessions, some participants have been unable to hear the video for some reason. So one, we suggest closing other applications, and two, if you can't hear the audio, please just bear with us. It's about 6 minutes. Note that the video is available currently on our website under membership. Go down to focus area committee and scroll down to the bottom in the resources section. You can see that email, you can see that video there. We'll also circulate the links. So Janelle, go ahead and cue that up. Okay, so hopefully that was a good sneak peek at the platform for most of you. Again, if not,
Sorry.
okay, awesome. So if you weren't able to hear for whatever reason, the link is in the chat as well as directly available on the website. So during that video, I just kind of want to point out two kind of key areas that you might have seen. On the right-hand side, we were showing the scoring rubric. So you might not have been able to see specifically, but there's essentially 7 questions that we're evaluating on a 1 to 4 scale. Each of those are multiple choice, and those evaluation criteria help to kind of direct what a 1 score might look like, or a 2 or 3 or 4. So we really try to include those guidelines to help guide you through the scoring process. But you'll notice as you're reading the application, as you're reading the scoring questions, that it really is subjective and will require a fair bit of judgment in terms of, well, is this project really transformational? Does that feel like a 1 score or a 3 score? So you'll definitely notice that throughout the process. So it's not intended to kind of remove some of that judgment, but really to help give you some guidelines to think about. Also, once you complete that review, all of the scores will be automatically calculated. So you can enter and exit the review as many times as you need. It's automatically saved, but no score is calculated until you actually hit the submit button. So at that point, then the review for that specific application will be closed. And as I said in the video and on the previous slide, we kind of ask that you kind of read through all the applications that you're assigned, get a sense of what that playing field, if you will, looks like before you go in and start scoring individual applications. Because again, once you submit it, then it will be closed. I do see a hand in the air. Alice?
Yes. When you are evaluating these grants, should we be expected to do our own research? Say, for example, if someone is, I'm on education, if someone has some kind of proposal for X, should I be researching X to determine whether that need has already been met by other groups?
Yeah.
Or, should I be doing that type of research and coming up with my evaluation, or should I just be focusing on what they have provided us?
Certainly, that's a great question. I think the idea is that the applicants are really providing enough information so that you can evaluate the application on a standalone basis. We're not asking anybody to be experts in this area, even on individual focus area committees where you may have prior experience. And so there may naturally be areas where you're not familiar and need to do your own research just to get yourself educated on, specific terms that you may see in the application, or just kind of a better understanding of the kind of need for that program. However, we really do expect that the applicants have done a great job of explaining in a very clear way what the project is, what the need that they have identified, how they're going to address that need, and more so how they're going to implement the project to define and measure that success of that program. And so, I do think there may be a little bit of research that you may want to do, but we certainly don't expect that members will need to do a lot of independent research. Carol, I see your hand. You're on mute as well.
Oftentimes when we're doing these evaluations and we have more than 1 or 2 or 5 or whatever, and then you score 1 and you say, wow, this is good, and then you score another one, and next thing you know, you got 2. Do we need to be concerned about that, in terms of, what happens when you realize that you've scored 2 people at the same level? You can't go back. Can you go back? and change.
Correct. Once you hit submit, the scoring is locked for your
It's
review of that application. What I would suggest is that you look at all of the applications that you have assigned to get a sense of what's out there. So if you are looking at one and you say, oh, this is amazing, and I score it, you know, let's say 10 out of 10. And then I get another one and say, oh, this is even better. I think this one's a 10 out of 10. Now looking back, that one's probably more of an 8 out of 10. You know, if you've already hit submit, that will be locked in. However, that being said, you know, a lot of the ultimate decision making in terms of narrowing it down from whatever population we start with down to our top applications, there will be ongoing dialogue. And so we'll talk a little bit of that. So that is another opportunity to bring that conversation to the group. And maybe some of those that started off being 8 will move up, and those that we might have thought were 10 will move down throughout that dialogue process. And so don't be overly concerned about how you score one, at least initially. But because of that, it is good to kind of review all of the applications on your plate, so you kind of have a sense of at least how you're thinking of scoring for the applications that you're reviewing.
All right. Thank
So
you.
when we receive our applications through the portal, that's going to be it. There's not going to be others coming in afterwards. They'll all be there at the ones that you're supposed to be looking at will all come to you at the same time.
Yes, that's the expectation. That's right. Okay, Janelle, next slide.
Tina, I think Kathy had her hand raised.
Oh.
Kathy, did you?
Yeah, and maybe this will be covered later. Is somebody, or at some point, do we do an analysis, sort of a risk analysis? Are there any red flags in terms of governance or people or scandals and the like? And at some point, is that going to factor in to the decision? You know, doing some background checks, and will that be centralized or part of the reviewer's obligation?
That's a good question. I mean, there's definitely going to be some of the dialogue in terms of the people. And I think we will definitely have a deep financial review process going on in round 2 from the finance committee. For those that make it into the semi-finalist round, there will also be site visits. And so I think a lot of some of the things that you're mentioning will come out through the through the site visit review as well. Sharon, I don't know if you want to talk about background checks and other you know, review specific to individuals within the nonprofit.
It's such an interesting question, Kathy, and you know, we've seen living in this area over the last several decades, you know, some very well-known nonprofits get in trouble with scandals. I would say that the round 1, we're really focusing on the application and the program, a little bit looking at the budget. The in-depth review by the finance committee, I think, will really review anything of concern, because they'll be looking at least 3 years of records. And then again, in the site visit, you know, there may be an opportunity to ask about board member involvement. You know, you could ask basically anything you want during that process. So I think that it's pretty comprehensive. We haven't thought about specifically, like, do we have a some sort of criteria to make sure that this organization hasn't been involved in a particular scandal. But I think we would see, certainly in terms of a financial scandal, that will come out in the finance review that Latina is going to be in charge of in round 2.
So in our first round, we basically can just do it based on the paper, not based on some vague knowledge we might have.
Yeah, I would
We might be able
even
to give a notation if we've heard something about something, just to give people.
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to say is that the scoring is really just the beginning of the process, and what's going to really happen is when you start talking about it. You know, I hesitate to even, you know, think about including I heard that this organization had blankety blanket blank. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about disclosures and affiliations and conflicts of interest, that sort of thing down the road. But I think that it's the sort of thing that you guys would discuss in your group. And if there was some concern, then you would probably do some additional research at the, if the chair thought that was advised.
So the second, that was a great question. It definitely gives us something to think about. So to kind of close the loop on the second item, you probably didn't see specifically in the video, but one of the questions that we had that we are scoring does relate to the initial budget review. And here we're not asking for a full deep dive financial review that will happen in the second round. What we really want you to evaluate is how well the budget aligns with the project and the budget narrative. So, do the costs appear to be substantiated? If, for example, the project expenses far exceed the grant dollars, are there other sources of income that would address the shortfall? How much of those grant dollars are going towards operating costs? We're really looking at that number to be 15% or less, or is there, another, kind of valid reason why they're looking for more in terms of operating costs? So again, this is really a completeness and comprehensiveness review in terms of, have they provided the information that we're asking for, and does it kind of all hold together and make sense? And definitely not looking for you to do much more than that from a financial review process. Okay, Sharon, on to you for grant review criteria.
Great. And I just have to say, I'm really excited to hear that there are so many grant writers in this group, because as we've developed this process, from the very beginning, I think starting in the spring, we tried to be really sensitive to, how hard it is for grant writers to do this work. So we tried to make the process for the nonprofits filling out this application as easy as possible, avoiding any unnecessary obstacles to completing the application. So in terms of what we're looking at in reviewing the grant and what we most care about, our priorities, there's a slide here that talks about some of the issues that we will be considering. I thought it would be maybe helpful to talk about this in terms of a real life example. So the other day I was listening to an NPR interview with a gentleman in LA who has created an inner city youth orchestra there. It turns out that less than 1.8% of musicians in professional orchestras are Black, and even fewer kids in youth orchestras are Black. So this maestro has put together an inner city youth orchestra that is addressing an unmet need in his community. He has created a program where kids have easy access. It's right there in the city. Most other youth orchestras are in like outlying suburbs and that sort of thing, where a lot of the inner city kids can't get to. There's no tuition, so cost is not an obstacle. There are no auditions. So if you weren't, learning Suzuki violin at the age of 4, you're still eligible to join the orchestra. And he's working on expanding this to other cities throughout the country. In fact, he said every city that has an NFL team should have an inner city youth orchestra. That's his goal. So I thought that was like an awesome way of, that's the sort of thing we're looking at here. This is something that is in the arts and culture focus area. It has a tremendous impact. It's meeting a really unmet need. And it's going to be truly transformational, not just for the children in the program, but for orchestras in general. Hopefully, certainly starting in LA and throughout the country. So let's see. Next slide, Janelle.
Can I ask a question before we move on?
Yep.
And maybe this will become more clear in the subsequent slides. We've talked about this a lot at some of the Zoom meetings we've had for the organization, but it has never really been defined. And that is, what exactly do we mean by transformational?
That's
Or is it in the eye of the beholder, which is fine, but it's
you know, I'm actually, I'm not sure if Anne remembers. I'm not sure if we define it on the website. I would say when we're talking about transformational, so in one sense, what we're looking for in terms of who we're targeting, you know, these smaller and medium-sized nonprofits with budgets between 300,000 and 5 million. And that's because we want the grant amount itself to be transformational to the organization. We want the organization to be small enough so that when they get a $100,000 grant, they're like, whoa,
Okay.
this is going to allow us to do something we could never have done without this grant. This is a great big grant that's going to let us do something new. And transformational, you know, what is the impact going to be on the community? It could be having a tremendously important impact on a very small number of people, like maybe moving people out of homelessness, or, you know, curing addictions, or it could be something that has a lesser impact, but it affects an entire region. So transformational is really somewhat in the eye of the beholder. Right? I think a lot of our criteria are, you know, extremely subjective. I know we had the opportunity to talk to the folks from Metro Detroit, where Latina previously worked, and they said one of the things that they were doing was really looking for leaders. When they met with these organizations and looked at these grants, they said, they're not only looking at the project, but they're looking at who's leading this. And they said they just had tremendous success in finding people who, you know, through this single grant got the traction to become, you know, not just incredibly successful in Metro Detroit, but they're like, now they're known nationally. So you know, we've been getting questions from some outside organizations, nonprofits, saying, you know, we've got a budget a little in excess of 5 million. Can we still apply? And it's hard to say no, but we say no. You know, we set this parameters, you know, for a reason, and it's partly because we do want the grant itself to have an opportunity to be transformational for the organization. So we're not looking just at the impact in the community, which is of course very important, but, you know, also on the organization itself and its leadership. Does that?
That helps.
And we may actually define it on the website. I just can't remember off the top of my head.
You know,
we have some language as guidelines. I mean, we're trying not to define it too narrow, but I mean, all the points that Sharon touched on is what we're getting at. It's so, you know, does it solve a problem, right? Does it satisfy a need or create an opportunity for strategic change? So we really want to understand, you know, who are the people involved in, you know, in getting the project off to the ground. We want to see the big picture, you know, how are they addressing these needs? You know, what's the impact that it's ultimately going to have, you know, on the community, society as a whole, you know, what have you. So it is very broad, it is very subjective, but at the end of the day, as Sharon said, we want a project that we can get behind as a chapter and just be kind of blown away by what they're trying to do and what we believe this grant will ultimately be able to do.
Okay, thank you both.
Yep. And this slide sort of goes in a little more, you know, succinctly what we're looking at in terms of the criteria. And I guess in this particular slide, what I would have you pay close attention to is the second part of the slide. And this is getting back to a little bit of what Kathy was saying. Not only are we looking for a terrific project, but we want to make sure that the organization who is bringing us this project, that we've done our due diligence, and we're pretty confident by the end of, you know, the site visit process. This is a trustworthy organization. They're very competent. They have the leadership, the board leadership, the staff, you know, involvement to execute this thing and bring it to, you know, to fruition. So the scoring rubric, when you guys start working with it, you will see like it does both sides of this equation. So because both parts are extremely important, right? Somebody could come up with a fantastic sounding plan, but we want to make sure that that organization either has had some experience in the arena, or if it's a new project, that they have, based it on some form of research, they've had some sort of guidance from experts or what have you. So that this is another key part of the grant review process. Okay, so we talked about this briefly, and as Latina said, some of this will depend on the size of your committee and the number of grant proposals your committee receives. But the idea basically is for each of the 5 focus area committees, we will assign a point person for each application that comes in. So there will be like a lead reader for each application. And this person will be responsible for knowing like the real ins and outs of this grant application, about the project itself, about the organization itself, a little bit about the budget and whatnot. There will be other readers and scorers of the application, but we do want to ensure that when you guys come together as a committee, some of these committees are going to be quite large, that there will be, just to sort of add some structure to the communications, there will be a single person who will present each application. And then of course the discussion will ensue. I think we're talking about right now how to make sure that everybody who wants to read or at least skim every application in your committee, that we can do that. We're working with the people at Submittable to just sort of finalize some technical questions that we have. But so that's sort of how that's gonna go. That's the next slide. Right, so you will, what we're hoping for you to do, and the way they have designed this platform is, you're gonna independently score these applications. So you will have a chance once you've scored them to come together and discuss them. But one of the things we do want is for you to come with your own, perspective, your own lived experience, and read each application through and score it on your own. So we don't want you biased by, say, knowing that 3 other readers have scored this, as a 10 out of 10, and you think, wait a minute, based on my experience, I would say this is actually a 3. We don't want you influenced by that. So you'll do your own scoring, then we'll come together. There'll be, as Latina said, the scores will be automatically entered into the program, and we'll get a mean score. And then of course you'll have the opportunity to talk. And I really do want to stress that the numbers in your scoring are important, but it's going to be the discussion of these applications that really, that decide what's going, who's moving on, who's not going to move ahead. Because it's sort of like, I think of it like college applications, a college that only looks at a kid's scores, how good an idea do they really have about the child if they're only looking at test scores? It's better to know a whole lot more about the student, what she will bring to the college. So anyway, so that's basically what we're going to do in terms of reading and scoring the grants.
So I have a question. I'm getting a little nervous because it sounds like, for example, I signed up for the education committee, but I'm not a teacher and I'm not an educator. That was not my background. And so my background didn't really fall into any of these categories necessarily. So I picked one that I would be interested in. So I'm not sure that that was the right way to
Absolutely
select a
right way.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Alice. The whole idea behind the Impact 100 is the women who come to this don't need any experience whatsoever, right? We've worked a long time with the chairs. The chairs do have some issue area expertise. We don't expect our members to bring issue area expertise to grant review. It's really on the applicant to present the whole picture in the application, right? They need to present a picture of the need. They need to document it so they're not just pulling, figures and out of the thin air. And you will know as you read through, like, does this hang together, or does this sound, this is never going to happen? Or does this sound like they've taken all the steps, to get from A to, C or whatever. So I'm glad you asked that. It's very, it's important that everyone feel good going into it and not worry about having any issue area expertise, because you shouldn't need it and you won't need it. And I've talked to other chapters before, women from other chapters, and asked them that same question. They said, people get it. Like you don't need any training coming into the process. Okay, let's do the next slide. Okay, ethics. So I know you guys will talk about this in more detail when you get together with your focus area committees, but whoops. One thing we will do is ask each of you to fill out a conflict of interest form so that we know in advance. So let's say you're on the education committee and it turns out you are on the board of directors of, let's say, Reading Partners. I know we have a member of the Reading Partners staff here with us tonight. If you're on the board of directors of Reading Partners and they filed an application in your focus area committee, you have a conflict of interest because you are able to influence substantial control over that organization. Similarly, if you had a major financial interest in an organization, we would consider that a conflict of interest and not want you trying to score that application. It just wouldn't be fair to the other applicants. So you will be filling out conflict of interest forms, and you will also be filling out a disclosure form, which is it meets a much lower standard. But let's say you were a volunteer for the Capital Area Food Bank, and over the past 6 months, you've gone and distributed food like 3 times. You have an affiliation with the Capital Area Food Bank, but that doesn't mean that you are, that you can't be impartial reviewing its application or the other applications in the pool that includes Capital Area Food Bank. So you would simply disclose the fact that you have an affiliation. Other members of your committee would know that you have that affiliation. And then if it turned out during the deliberations, when you guys are talking about the applications that, hey, it sounds like she said she can be impartial, but she's really advocating for Capital Area Food Bank, right? Then your chair might say, let's talk. Let's talk. So we want to be sure that we want to maintain the integrity of the process and make sure that that every single applicant comes and has the same exact chance of getting to the top, and that there's no individual on any of the committees who's going to help or hinder any particular applicants in the process. So I know as the grants team, we've talked about this a lot, and I think it's confusing in a lot of ways. So you guys will absolutely spend some time talking about this with your focus area committee chairs. And if you have any questions about it tonight, obviously feel free to ask a question. And then we're back to Latina.
All right, thanks, Sharon. So we have here on the screen some high-level grant review guidelines. I'm not going to read all these. I think, in general, we're all adults, and they, are pretty straightforward in terms of respecting members and understanding that, there's going to be a lot of dialogue. And as Sharon indicated, we're asking all of that to, remain within the focus area committee discussions. A couple of things that I do just want to draw attention to is that, being objective and really making sure that we are, focusing on the strongest initiative, even if it's not your personal favorite, kind of goes into some of the affiliation discussion that Sharon just mentioned. We bring a lot to the table, and we'll probably do a lot of that during the discussion process, but we do want to make sure that we're really thinking objectively about, some of the points of view that we're bringing to the table. So Janelle, if you go to the next slide, we bring this up because we want to spend a bit of time talking about the topic of unconscious bias. So I know there's been a lot of talk about this subject over the past year and even much further beyond that. And There's a lot of good work that's being done in this space, a lot of surveys and conversations, presentations. So we recognize that, many of you may already kind of be on a journey to better understand unconscious bias. So some of us may be on different points along that spectrum. And so we just want to spend a few minutes talking about it here and why it is relevant to our grant review process. But at a high level, really just wanted to, kind of mention that when we're talking about a bias, generally speaking, it's preference or prejudice, maybe for something, against something. Everyone naturally has biases. It's just part of what makes us humans. Some of those, behaviors are learned, others are more innate. They're not always bad. It really only becomes an issue when it creates positive or negative impacts on someone else, or creates an unfair advantage or disadvantage for others. So, when we think about, this concept of objectivity, one of the main reasons why unconscious bias really happens is that we're just processing so much information, we're making judgments and determinations. Sometimes we do that in ways that can have, unintended consequences. And so we really just want to bring attention to, what may be happening in our unconscious minds, because then and only then can we then, really make those decisions that take actions that are more aligned with our declared beliefs. And so we do have some materials, one of which is a video that I would like to share. It's specific on the topic of enhancing objectivity. So again, if you can't hear the video, this one will have subtitles. So hopefully that will be enough for you to follow along. But if not, this video, as well as others, are available on the website and in that same resources section on the Focus Area Committee tab. So Janelle, do you mind queuing up the enhanced objectivity video? Thanks, Janelle. So going on to the next slide, I think, that video really showed some great examples, particularly with the numbers, right? How we can very quickly hone in on something that we believe to be true and kind of make decisions that align with that. So, in the grant review process, when we're thinking about, the halo effect, you may have an organization that submits an application that you've had a very positive experience with in the past, and you've only got great things to say. And so no matter what they put on the paper from a project experience, you are convinced it's going to be amazing. And so, that's all you can see. And on the flip side of that, the horns effect, you may have an experience with an organization. Oh, they were really disorganized. They're not going to be good to work with. So no matter how great their project sounds, I don't think that they will do a good job, right? They're not going to be able to see this thing through. And that level of preconceived thinking may, sometimes get in the way of being able to look at things objectively and really evaluate what's on the page and in front of you. So, the reason why we wanted to talk about here is because even though it does occur subconsciously, unconsciously, there are things that we can do to mitigate the impacts. First, we have to identify that there is a potential for bias. So know that it exists, and that, again, may not necessarily be a bad thing, but we just have to be prepared to challenge ourselves accordingly. And so we're asking that everybody kind of look at all of the evidence objectively, ask yourself questions, right? When you're developing your point of view, bring in other perspectives to maybe expand your thinking. Give yourself enough time to really thoughtfully review the grant, so you're not kind of rushing through and relying on those, kind of snap judgments that your brain may shortcut to. We've put together the scoring rubric to try to provide guidelines that may help you in that scoring process. So really, think about that scoring rubric, rely on that as a basis to identifying your scores. And then really check your, kind of gut feelings. If you have that natural tendency to gravitate towards something, stop and ask yourself why. What's, really, what's really behind those decisions or that thinking. So you may see that, oh, I now naturally gravitate towards nonprofits that are in my own area or my own community. So, do I have a level of distance bias? Or maybe I prefer nonprofits that serve people that look or act like me, or people that I know. So is there a similarity bias at work? We really want to, give ourselves that safe space to be able to have those conversations and really start with a place of positive intent. So, if there is a point of view that's provided, like assume positive intent, right? And just be open to have the conversation, to dig into the whys behind our decisions. And I think, that will serve us, as a focus area committee and as a chapter very, very well in the process. And so, as Sharon kind of went through in the criteria, Janelle, if you go on to the next slide, we talked about using this lens of equity. And so I want to spend a quick second to talk about this concept of equity versus equality. And I think this, picture really shows well what the differences are. If you think about equality as trying to give everybody the same thing, access to the same resources and opportunity, whereas equity is really thinking about who are the individuals in the target population, what are their needs, and how do we then allocate those resources accordingly. So thinking about our grant review process and keeping that lens of equity will be really, really important throughout. Next slide, Janelle. And we have pulled together, some resources to be able to help you. There's a lot out there. So in no means is this intended to be a fully exhaustive list, but this information is available on our website, and we've got some links here on the slides that we'll send out as well. So I'll just kind of pause there for any immediate questions before we move on to round two.
not a question, just a comment, which is the D&I practitioner in me loves that you all spent some time on that piece. I think it's a good reminder for all of us as we enter this process. So thank you for doing that.
Absolutely. Okay, moving into round two. So this is once the focus area committees identify their top applications, those round two applications will go through a deep financial review. We'll dive into a lot more around the metrics. So understanding, what are the revenue trends? How's the overall health of the financial health of the organization? We may also provide some questions that we think may be helpful to think about during the site visits. But I really just kind of want to point out that, the finance review process is not intended to override what's happening in the focus area committees. It's really a process to help arm the focus area committees with some additional information. So, in my mind, any of those applications that go on to round two, what the focus area committee is saying, we think any of these could be the grant recipient, right? And so then the finance review committee is going to go through and say, here are some additional things that you need to think about. If this was going to be the grant recipient, we either feel really good about that or we have some concerns from a financial health perspective. So Janelle, if you go to the next slide, the way I see the finance committee really providing that communication is almost like a traffic light. So I think about, a green light review would be, hey, these guys seem really strong, their revenue is trending well, they've got multiple sources of income, their expenses are reasonable, we don't see anything that would suggest that maybe there's challenges or, inability for the organization to financially execute on the grant. So we have, little to no concerns about them being able to execute. Kind of like the yellow light might be, hey, we do have some questions. I think ultimately those questions are probably things that we can resolve during the site visit, maybe just clarifying a few points, maybe some very minor concerns, but overall seem quite strong. And then the red light, again, this isn't necessarily to say they're dead in the water, but we would say we have some really significant concerns here. We're not really comfortable certifying that they would be able to execute on the grant. Maybe there's some trends that we're seeing. Maybe there's lack of, diversified sources of income. And so those might be things that cannot be easily resolved just through communication. And so there might be a lot more that we would need to do to really get comfortable. And so again, the finance review is not to say, no, these guys can't move forward. But it's really designed to provide that information that if they were to move forward, we would either have some concerns or we wouldn't. So then coming out of the finance review recommendations, then the focus area committees are going to regroup. They're going to start to prepare for the site visits. We won't get into a ton of detail in terms of what's will be discussed at the site visit in this session. But really that's the opportunity to get more of the one-on-one with the organization, really meet the people, understand what their plan is, how they plan to execute, and really ask those questions that might not be directly apparent from the application process. And then determine from there who the finalists are. So once the focus area committees take their top number of applicants down to one, there will be one finalist from each focus area committee, and those finalists will come together for a meet the finalist event in June, and then ultimately the membership will vote. Everybody gets a vote for the finalists that they would like to be the grant recipient, and we will award that grant in September at our big award ceremony. So Janelle, the last slide here that we have is really next steps. And so again, not to reiterate everything that we just went over, but in terms of immediate next steps, your finance committee chair likely has already reached out in terms of an initial meeting date to kind of meet the committee, start to kind of establish an overall meeting cadence, to answer any additional questions that you guys may have. Hopefully at that point, you will have gone into a submittable and played around with the test application. So definitely, be prepared to bring any additional questions that you have coming out of this training into that first meeting with your focus area committee chair, as they will be, your primary point of contact while going through the review process.
First of all, thank you all for being here tonight and going through this with us. And second of all, to thank Sharon and Latina in particular for their presentations, and then to thank the entire team, all of the grants chairs, for all the work that they have done and will continue to do. This is really a learning community. We are in this together to learn from each other. And from the whole process. So it gives me goosebumps to think about it. And I'm glad you're all on this journey with us. So thanks so much for being here.